Putting history into periods is a dangerous game that probably wouldn't have meant much to the people of the past. No one woke up one day and thought they were in the Middle Ages after all. Today's guest, Ada Palmer, is going to talk to us about the idea of the Renaissance. When do we say the medieval becomes the Renaissance? And what does it mean when we say it does? It gets complicated. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello, welcome to another episode of Future Imperfect with me, your host, Jason Kingsley. It's been a bit hectic of a day, so if I sound a little bit more stressed this morning, I apologise. I had a horse-related incident. Everybody's okay. I have a wonderful guest with me today, Ada Palmer. Ada, thank you for accommodating all the time changes and all the shenanigans with the Earth being a globe.
Yes, I've been looking forward. This is a treat.
Could you introduce yourself, please, and maybe sort of discuss your new book a little bit and telling us what it's all called?
Sure. I'm Ada Palmer. I'm a science fiction and fantasy novelist and historian. I teach at the University of Chicago. I work on how ideas and history change each other over time, which is how it spans both science fiction and nonfiction. And my academic specialties are the Italian Renaissance, especially the history of censorship and the Inquisition. I work a lot on radical thought, persecution of atheists, how the radical underground prospers, even when there's a regime trying to stop it.
Now, for me, the Renaissance is the thing that comes after the time I'm particularly interested in. But of course, there's a huge blending, isn't there? There's no point where anybody ever woke up and went, oh, great, we're in the Renaissance now. How wonderful.
Right.
It's only with hindsight. So what sort of defines this concept that we come up with as historians of a Renaissance? What do you mean by it? And what do other people mean by it?
Yeah, that's actually what the book is about, because, the title Inventing the Renaissance, it's about the construction of this period and how we come to have this idea of a Renaissance golden age in contrast with a medieval age that was somehow worse or stagnant or negative or dark compared with the Renaissance, which is a widespread idea now. It was a widespread idea 100 years ago. It was a widespread idea 200 years ago, even though all of our actual evidence shows that it's completely untrue. So the question is half, where did the myth come from? And half, why is the myth so hard to get rid of when we know perfectly well and have known for centuries that it isn't true? And so part of the book is about the invention of the Renaissance and of the medieval Dark Age within the Renaissance, because it's in the very end of the 1300s and in the 1400s that the idea of drawing a line comes up, and people divide history into three parts for the first time: ancient, middle, and the period that they're in. Mm-hmm. But another part of the book is about why that myth is so useful to us. And so part of this is a 19th century story and a 20th century story about why people find it useful over and over to retell this old lie about there being Rome and then a fall and then a dark age and then a golden age. The secret being, of course, that there's no such thing as a dark age or a golden age, in fact, ever at all in the entire historical record.
Well, I suppose we have to give labels to things. And I always think labels in astronomy are interesting because they run out of clever names for things further away you go. And then they start calling stars with numbers. And that's really, A, hard to remember. And B, it's not very poetic. I quite like poetic names. But the trouble is, it does bring baggage with it when you use a word, doesn't it?
Exactly. And, when we talk about a white dwarf, it sounds more beautiful than when we talk about a brown dwarf, just because of our aesthetic feelings about these two colors, even though they're equally astronomically exciting, right? But with the Renaissance, the name itself gives it this cachet and charisma and the idea of rebirth and artistic flourishing. And this is a very politically useful myth. And what we've seen over the past couple of centuries is how useful it is to be able to compare yourself to the Renaissance and claim that whatever you're doing will bring about a rebirth and a golden age. And that whatever your rivals or alternatives or enemies are doing is similar to the bad, no good, dark, stagnant Middle Ages.
Well, it's very othering, isn't it?
Right. And this is useful if you're a politician. You're trying to say that you'll cause something good compared to others. It's useful if you're a party. It's useful if you're a corporation, and you want to have a beautiful Renaissance logo and compare your enemies to something stagnant. And what that means is that whenever historians talk about new ideas of what is going on in these periods, and especially new ideas about what may have caused the changes between the medieval period and what we call the Renaissance, so the changes that happen in 1300 and 1400, those tend to get picked up and magnified by journalists and op-ed writers and turn into something that becomes divorced from its historical origin. So, for example, in the sort of second fifth of the 20th century, there is a popular suggestion that one of the things that causes the acceleration in the Renaissance toward a golden age is advances in banking. And the idea that there were new banking techniques for the lending of money and international exchange of currencies that are developed over the course of the 1100s and 1200s and that really come into their flourishing at this moment, enabling masses of new trade and exchange of goods, and how you're making a sculpture out of stone that was imported from Turkey all the way to Italy, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore that what causes the beginning of the arc of history bending toward modernity is banking and the beginning of capitalism. And this becomes really popular during the Cold War. And you get lots of op-eds and discussions of how, capitalism caused the Renaissance. And this proves that the capitalistic West is the future of the world. And communism is like the bad, no good, communal, stagnant Middle Ages that are therefore doomed to cause a dark age, right? And you can see how completely divorced from the actual historical evidence, this becomes a useful rhetorical argument for people to make. And there have been other moments at which the bend toward the Renaissance and modernity has been attributed to other things. Another popular one, especially in the 19th century, was the idea that it was the birth of nationalism and having a national spirit and sort of nations realizing for the first time that they should unify and rebel against outside control and try to have the correspondence of, one people equals one nation that the 19th century was so big about. And that's what caused the Renaissance Golden Age and the bend toward modernity. And this argument is really popular with the nationalist movements in the mid-19th century that are pushing toward the unification of Germany and then the unification of Italy. And they find their antecedents and say, therefore, when we do this, it will cause a golden age. And the systems that we have had up until this point are a dark age. And over, people come up with different ideas of what caused this supposed bend toward first a golden age and then modernity, in order to be able to say whatever I'm doing resembles and is the continuation of and will be like this Renaissance. And whatever my rivals are doing is going to be like the bad, no good Middle Ages.
Well, it's that classic story that's been used throughout history, I would imagine, which is it was once good, and as a result of the other people who I'm now competing against, it's all gone really bad, and I will make it good again for you. And people repeatedly swallow that line, don't they? It seems to be partly a function of the way human beings think about things. It's always somebody else can help you out of the situation more than you can help yourself. And that's sometimes possible, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I was just rereading the opening of book 2 of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, which is a very, very Renaissance book about how to be the ideal companion to a prince that's written in the 1520s. And sure enough, it begins with this discussion of why is it that everybody thinks that in their grandparents' day, everything was better. And when you talk to old people, they always talk about how everything was wonderful when they were young and how these days nobody can write poetry and nobody can be a political leader and our armies are weak and cowardly and everything was so much better before. And, it could have been written in any generation between 1520 and now.
Yes. You can literally slide it 50 years and keep sliding it 50 years and exactly the same things are. They're used to sell us stuff, I guess. That's what it's there. It's used to sell us give these people political power and they'll make everything okay. Turns out they are no more capable of making everything okay. And in some cases, capable of making it a lot worse. There's sort of references to this in ancient literature as well. I would imagine that you get this situation, if we do get it throughout history. Are there any records of people going, in ancient Greece, really ancient Greece was really good? And
yeah, you certainly get, and in the early days of the Republic when men were real men and women were real women and so on, kinds of things in Antiquity. But you get less discussion of the idea of Golden Age, Dark Age, Golden Age again. And that structure, as we understand it, the idea of fall, Dark Age, and then rise, as opposed to just, it was really good and now it's kind of meh. Right?
Yes.
Which is different from the idea of a dramatic fall and then a terrible dark age and then a restoration. That idea is invented in the Renaissance. It's invented by Petrarch and then Leonardo Bruni, who are the first figures to divide history like that and to say that there was this dark age following the fall of antiquity.
I mean, it's almost a narrative structure, isn't it? I mean, literally, stories, they start out with a challenge and then transformation and then, a success at the end of the story in the very, very simplest form of fictional narrative. And so I hadn't really thought about it. So in many ways, the whole history can be viewed in the same way. If you want clicks on your book back in the day when book sales and all of that kind of thing were the only way you had of communicating with people. But just back to this period, this Renaissance or Renaissance, depending on how you pronounce it, would people living in it recognize it as different? I mean, I often think guns start to come in at the end of the medieval period. You've got printing presses coming in at the end of it. You've got banking. Cavalry becomes less important in frontal charges. So there were lots of changes that came along at the end of the medieval period. Were they made manifest in the Renaissance period? And were there differences that we can point at? Or is it just a continuum?
So we can come back to printing press specifically in a bit, because I would place that as almost a century into Renaissance already by the time you get printing press.
Okay.
Which touches on how the dates of when medieval becomes Renaissance are really, really fluid and everybody disagrees about it.
Okay.
And that's one of your clues that this isn't real. And that this line is made up. Because if I go on campus and I head out of my office and I turn right and go to the English department and ask people when Renaissance begins, they'll say, well, the Renaissance is Shakespeare. And so it's coming to its peak with the debut of Hamlet in 1600, which means it's really getting going by 1550. And you have the early stages of 1500. And if I turn left out the same door and go to where the Italian lit department people are and ask them when Renaissance is, they'll say, oh, well, the Renaissance is 1250. And it's really getting going by the later 1300s. And it's kind of in decline by the 1420s. And it's definitely over by 1500. So when I turn left, it's over by the time it begins on the other side. Because everyone is defining Renaissance based on when their stuff was really great.
Okay.
And so if your particular nation's pride is in a playwright who's writing in 1600, that's Renaissance for you. If your nation's pride is in Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, then you move it much earlier. And you get a very wiggly when the beginning of Renaissance is, because what is the Renaissance? It's when we made great art.
Right.
And then modern stuff happened. And the vagueness of that means that there's huge disagreement about when the Renaissance begins and also when it ends. But going back to what you were asking about in terms of people on the ground realizing it, even in its own day, the Renaissance is a propagandistic construction. And when it begins in Petrarch at the very end of the 1300s, he articulates it as, we could make a golden age. Let's try. Let's imitate the ancients. Let's send out expeditions to find books and recapture all of these things they used to do in order to be able to do golden age construction and golden age politics. And then we will transform our world. And the people who buy into this are the people who feel like they are in some kind of crisis and they want something different. So the biggest first funders of, hey, let's have Renaissance classical architecture, let's have Renaissance classical everything, are people who are in power and scared and weak, right? The first monarch to invest heavily in Renaissance stuff is Matthias Corvinus, who has just become king of Hungary by literally being dragged out of a dungeon where he'd been imprisoned and where his elder brother had been executed. And being king of Hungary was so terrifying and scary, and they'd wiped out in civil wars and mutual destruction all of the other potential princes, and nobody wanted to be king of Hungary. They're like, you become king of Hungary. And he's like, oh shit, I'm gonna die.
He's volunteered.
Right?
Yeah.
What do I do? And here are these Italians saying, if you build buildings that look like Roman palaces and you make portraits of yourself or you look like Caesar on a coin and you hire scholars to write all of your speeches and correspondence so you sound like these intimidating rhetoricians like Cicero of Antiquity, then everyone will look at you and say, wow, that man is definitely above us. That man is definitely different. That man definitely deserves to be a king. And so he, invests in marrying an Italian princess and spends a whole lot of money on Renaissance culture so that when people come to his palace and see it, they say, wow, I'm just a random Hungarian warlord. This guy is Caesar, right? So it's a political tool. And you actually see a very one-to-one correspondence between how unstable and weak a government is and how quickly they invest in Renaissance things. England, for example, invests big in hiring Renaissance people to come during the infancy and childhood of Henry VI, when the rivalries between the Duke of Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort are each trying to control the crown, and they both hire Italians to come from Italy with all this stuff to rewrite their correspondence so it sounds like Cicero. So that when you receive a letter from them, you're like, whoa, these guys are impressive. They sound like Cicero. I should definitely let them control the kingdom. And you see much less serious investment in Italian Renaissance Roman stuff when England later gets more stable under Henry VIII, right? A strong king doesn't need it. A weak king needs it.
That's interesting. Yes, so I was thinking of Henry VIII's rule and the sort of schism with the papacy and, the changes in religion. Mm-hmm. And I suppose, Henry's kingdom was very, very strong, very wealthy, lots of wool going backwards and forwards. So he could afford psychologically and physically to assert his own components of being judged rather than trying to import them at great expense from a nobler time or a more expensive place. So this notion of bringing stuff in from antiquity is an interesting one, sort of importing it.
Yeah.
I presume in places like Rome, where they had the antiquity around them, they were also referring to the past as well. Or did they perhaps refer to ancient Greece?
I mean, they did refer to Greece a bit, but Rome is always the center. And even when you're in Rome, the statue is there, crooked, lying half buried in the ground. You dig it up, you move it 10 feet to the left, you put it on a plinth, you put your name on it, and you've activated antiquity in an important way that was always there, and you've made it part of a rhetorically new thing. And this is one of the elements that is propagandistic, right? The Middle Ages had antiquity the whole time, and they never didn't use Latin, and they never didn't refer to the Caesars, and they never didn't learn all of their Roman history. And education was always based on the Latin classics, and they were always reading Virgil, and they were always reading Cicero. The idea in the Renaissance that kicks off with Petrarch and his immediate followers is to propagandistically construct this as we're using antiquity in a totally new way. And the new way is to try to restore antiquity and make a golden age. And the rhetoric comes out of the motive. The motive is perceived weakness, right? So here we are in northern Italy in these tiny, fragile city-states that have very small armies, but where the rise of banking has concentrated enormous wealth. So we have tiny armies because we have very few actual residents. There isn't a huge countryside from which to levy tens of thousands of troops. But we have masses of money. We have literal bags of gold piled in the basement of these wealthy merchant families. These are the richest cities in Europe. They all hate each other. Every city hates its neighbors. They've all fought dozens of wars against their neighbors, which means if someone comes to attack you, no one is going to help. And they're all living in the plot of Romeo and Juliet, in which half of the noble families are Guelphs and half of the noble families are Ghibellines, and this feud has been going on for 300 years, and they all loathe each other, and they're all ready to murder each other in the street at any time. And when that's your situation, and meanwhile, there are these large, strong external monarchies like Aragon and France, who can come across the seas or over the Alps with armies an order of magnitude larger than you can possibly muster, and come and sack your city and take those bags of gold. And there's nothing you can do, militarily speaking. You can hire mercenaries, but the mercenaries don't want to fight a big, serious royal army. Mercenaries want to fight little armies and go home. And a mercenary by his very nature is bribable. And if it looks like he's going to lose the battle, he's going to pull out, right?
And quite a lot of English went over to do that.
Yeah. John Hawkwood, there's a wonderful book about John Hawkwood as a major mercenary of this period and was constantly being paid the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars to sit out of battles or
don't
not
fight.
Switch sides. Can we keep you on retainer to not fight this season?
I just wonder when he came up with that idea, it's like, hang on a second, I can get money from both sides to fight nobody. I get twice as much money.
Yes. So they're in the midst of that, and then they read accounts of the early Roman Republic, right? And they read about this period when statesmen from ruling families would sacrifice their lives for Rome because they felt it was their duty. And when the original Roman Brutus, the one from whom the later Brutus who killed Caesar is descended, When he was elected the first consul after kicking the kings out of Rome and his sons conspired to take over the state and make him king, he executed his own sons for treason against the state, for trying to make him king. Can you imagine Lord Montague executing Romeo for treason against Verona? It's just not happening, right?
No.
That ideal of loyalty to the state and to the people felt like this impossible dream of political success when you're living in the midst of feud and betrayal. And so we associate the Renaissance with the technology, with the art and linear perspective and aqueducts and arches and engineering. That's what survives that we see easily. But the original call, as Petrarch articulates it, is what we need to reconstruct is the libraries that raised Caesar, and that raised Seneca, and that raised Cicero. If we can reconstruct those libraries, if we can find the books that were the ethical formation that taught these virtues to these great ancient republican princes, and raise the next generation of our rulers like that, have that be the education of young Romeo and young Tybalt and young Juliet, then when they grow up, they will not knife each other in the street over petty feuds. They will say the good of Verona comes first. They will rule wisely, loyally, and better. And the feuding will end, and virtuous, prudent rule, as was seen in Antiquity, will take its place. And that will make a golden age. Now, when this is first articulated, they aren't saying this is a golden age. They're actually saying this is an age of ash and shadow. That's Petrarch's phrase. You could feel the dark age myth beginning, right? This is an age of ash and shadow. We can fix it.
Right.
Our moonshot is we need to get the libraries of the ancients to educate our elite to rule better. And that hope, that moonshot in the midst of powerlessness in the face of French and Spanish and German conquerors, is what gets the princes and wealthy merchant elites of Italy to invest in sending scholars trekking across the Alps to find books, and sending ships east to Constantinople to regain Greek and buy manuscripts and bring them back to recreate these libraries that they believe will bring about a golden age by morally improving the leaders.
So they sent people out on missions to get treasure to bring back, that was information treasure, largely, I guess.
Exactly.
To try and make their societies better. That's really interesting, because you think of all these historical, not tropes, but historical things that happened. How does that map across for you into the world of fantasy and make-believe? Because we were going to touch on book writing as well, because you're not just a scholar, but you're interested in fiction. And so some of these things, very interesting fictional kind of threads.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of fictional narratives about obtaining X in order to restore the kingdom, right? And X will sometimes be a magical MacGuffin, and X will sometimes be the virtuous true king, and X will sometimes be breaking the spell or defeating the evil bad guy. And that certainly often takes a golden age, golden age structure. Even when it doesn't, though, if we look at either a world of invented fantasy or indeed of science fiction, think about how often in the background of the past that has been invented by the author, there is a golden age and a dark age structure, right? And in the earliest days, there were elf princes and everything was great. And then the dark force rose, and then there were 150 or 500 or 5,000 years of darkness. And then there was the second glorious kingdom when this happened. And then it fell, and now we're in another dark age, right? Think about how constantly dark ages and golden ages are in the background. Even if we're on Mars, it'll be in the invented time between our real present and the time when the book takes place. We'll imagine there was a golden age of settling Mars, and then there was a bad stuff when tyrants arose and things, or there was a plague, right? It's really easy to understand. That's one thing. Like golden age and dark age, you just call it that. You can describe it incredibly easy. It's really unfussy. People are just ready to be like, yep, that's how history works. This makes perfect sense. I accept your backstory, and you don't have to explain all the economics.
Does it give you a narrative depth, though? Because you can, if you've got a previous golden age and a dark age, and you're coming out of the dark age or whatever, you've got these depths you can plumb for story beats.
It gives you layers.
Yeah.
It gives you layers. Now, it doesn't give you more layers than if you were like, well, at this stage, there was the empowerment of labor through the invention of a new economic system through which the produce of factories were distributed. And then at this other age, there was the development of political parties, and it caused this other thing, right? You don't need it to be Dark Ages and Golden Ages. Layers in your background are always going to enrich a story. Golden Ages and Dark Ages are some of the easiest layers to explain. And they have the least fussy detail, right? And you don't have to explain social class and economics and means of production. You just like Golden Age, Dark Age, you're done.
Yes, and when science fiction and fantasy get very extreme, it's almost like the author has struggles to explain the underlying components of this society that the stories do. And it almost outweighs the value of the sort of personal level narrative, whatever that personal level narrative might be.
Right. But if you walk past the cracked in half fallen marble statue of a king,
yeah,
you've accomplished your background world building just by describing the set behind which your characters are having their conversation. It's really easy.
Yes. And you've left questions in your reader's mind as well. What's that about? Mm-hmm. I mean, when I was writing Lord of Blackthorn, one of the things for me is it was quite tempting to try and completely plot out the sort of backstory and everything. And I actually felt that it was better if I sketched it out in my mind. I needed to know who the king was, what they were trying to do. But I kind of almost deliberately created bits of it for me that I wasn't sure about because I didn't want my characters to be sure about it either. And in some ways, I didn't want them to be lying. I want them to go, we don't actually know what was happening there. But something big happened. There's a big fight or whatever. Well,
and the more lightly you sketch something out in fiction, the more you're inviting the reader to fill it in with what they imagine. What they imagine will always make sense to them and will always be plausible to them and will never be wrong.
You need space for their imagination to fill in the gaps.
Exactly.
I suppose.
In the same way that if you don't describe how the spaceship works, they'll invent how the spaceship works and the spaceship will work plausibly for them. If you do describe how the spaceship works, then they can nitpick.
Right, of course. So that's the Star Wars versus Star Trek. I always think Star Trek is a bit more, here's the explanation, and we've now got ourselves into a really difficult place because the tech needs to work this way and it's all got to be consistent. Yeah. I mean, Doctor Who's a bit like that in that there's so much continuity and people kind of, it matters to many, many people for obvious reasons, but then you can tie yourself up in knots.
Yeah, I mean, the more you think it through and describe it, the more you have detailed material to work with. And you can make a really great story out of the physics of your power system at the heart of the TARDIS, right? And, you know, the more we get into how the Eye of Harmony actually produces energy for different functions back on Gallifrey and also in the TARDIS itself, the more we can draw on that for cool narratives. But if we never say anything and leave it vague, we have even more flexibility and the reader will always imagine something that is plausible to the reader or viewer in this case.
As long as it's consistent, self-consistent, because one of the things that bugs me a little bit sometimes, I love my fantasy, I love fantasy TV shows and things, but there was a scene in Game of Thrones, a jousting scene. Now, I joust for real. And I was just looking at the throat protection they had, and I was thinking, you don't want to joust with that very bad throat protection. You're going to get hit in the throat. It's a place you get hit in. And anybody that jousts knows that. And of course, it wasn't real jousting. It was stunt riders. They're very good. And the scene was wonderful. But for me, because I know too much about armor, I kind of nitpick.
Well, and more importantly, in the book, the throat protection isn't described. So in the book, the throat protection is correct.
Yes.
Because it's not described. So whatever it is, you fill it in and it's correct.
Yes.
In your head.
And it's the same with military costume and military protection. So, for example, it doesn't matter how your magic system works or whether there are dragons or giants or whatever. Armor is cumbersome. You want it to protect you. It doesn't matter that there are magical things going on. Maybe it has magical powers as well and protects you that way. But if it doesn't actually protect you, why bother wearing it? And as we discover through history, when firearms start to come in, people reluctantly drop protection because, quite frankly, there's nothing they can carry that's going to be protection until they come across with new materials like Kevlar and ceramic plates. And now that's come back in again. But you talk to contemporary soldiers about the armor they wear and it's hot and annoying. And I was talking to somebody who was in the first Gulf War, and they said they typically only wore the plates on their backs when they were patrolling. because they were never shot from the front. The ambush would always be when they've gone past and they'd be shot at from behind. So it was much easier. It was obviously completely against orders.
Right.
They always left there, but their plates were heavy and they were going to be shot at once every couple of weeks. So most of the patrols you go on, it's just annoying and sweaty and heavy. So you put the plate on the back, which I thought was vaguely interesting from a soldiers are practical as well as they want to survive. They've also got to do all the ordinary things. It's the same in a fantasy world or the same in any world. Where does the food come from? I always wondered that about Mordor, for example, with all those orcs. Think of the infrastructure needed to feed them all, those armies.
Especially when there isn't sunlight and therefore isn't agriculture in the area where they're working.
Yeah, probably better if we don't go into that. But it sometimes does make me think, the way quartermasters and feeding soldiers and how you dig latrines are really important, but they're not often celebrated in legend and story because they're boring details.
I mean, the work of Machiavelli we read least often is his Art of War, where he's like, and you need the rows of soldiers to be this many feet apart, and you need to feed them this material, and you shouldn't feed them fluffy baked bread because then you have to haul ovens around. You should feed them pancakes. And all of these technical details that he goes on at great length. And we're like, we don't like that one. We want the ones where he's speculating about political philosophy.
It is funny. I'm fascinated by the ordinary components of history as well.
Any world builder is.
Yeah. And so for me, how ordinary people live their lives is almost more important than how kings and princes and heroes live their lives, simply because most of us would have been ordinary. I think I was doing some research in medieval England, and 90% of the population were farmers. Basically, it's what peasant means. They lived on the land and they grew their own food largely. There weren't subsistence farmers. There were a bit more than that, and some were quite wealthy. But the vast bulk of people are ordinary in the nicest sense of the word. They don't do anything extraordinary, and they have pretty ordinary lives. Same as today, really, I suppose. How many people do we talk about on the news all the time? Not many.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about studying elites is to notice how horrible life was in the pre-modern world, no matter how rich you were. And that every single one of us now actually lives much better than a medieval king, because we have climate control and we have machines that are doing our laundry and our clothing isn't itchy and we don't have head lice. It's useful to remember that all humans had head lice all the time until the 1920s.
Right. Yes.
Right. And so if you're imagining yourself as a big evil king, you have head lice and your clothing is itchy and uncomfortable and you're either hot or cold and your food is rancid because there's no refrigeration and your alcohol tastes terrible because alcohol has gotten way better over time. And one of my favorites, you have intestinal parasites eating you from the inside, right? And the richer you were, so you could afford a wider variety of food, the more different kinds of intestinal parasites you had eating you from the inside. Oh. But we can tell your social class, if you're a medieval person, by your fossilized poop because of the variety of different parasite eggs that have been laid in it by the things that are eating your guts from the inside. So that's telling in its way as well.
Are there any fantasy books that really go into the nitty-gritty? Your hero is cold. They're sleeping on the floor. They're very uncomfortable. They've got a bad back.
I mean, to some extent, but we don't want to hear about people being cold and in pain all the time for hundreds of pages.
No, that's true.
That's something that is more explored in nonfiction, whereas in fiction, we want to see people overcoming this and moving on to go do stuff, like sail to Constantinople in a ship to get manuscripts and head back.
They gloss over the long walk to get to the volcano of doom or whatever,
or they describe the long walk at great length. I mean, most of Lord of the Rings is a long description of going for a walk.
Well, that's true.
It's just focusing on beauty of landscape, the fascinating areas that we meet along the way, the aesthetics of the gardens and the terrain and the geology, and best of all, the poetic language as we move along, and the ideas and philosophy that people are thinking about and discussing as they go. We don't want to hear about the headlines, at least not too often.
Do elves have intestinal parasites? Yeah, or dwarves? Very different ones, actually. If you were going to have different kinds of hominids, they can interbreed, though, so maybe they're subspecies. I don't know. The biology of Lord of the Rings could get very complicated very quickly, I would imagine.
Well, when you have one species that's effectively descended from stars and other species that are descended from biology,
you've got tree
you also
people
get a different situation.
I suppose. Yeah. So did the people in the Renaissance think of the medieval period? Did they divide it into dark ages? So
this has popularized just after 1400. And it's conceived right before and popularized right after 1400. But at the beginning, it's not, we're in a golden age. It's, we can make a golden age. Let's try. Let's find the books, reconstruct the libraries, and do the thing. And so at the beginning, it's a, hey, let's. And then a little while in, it's, okay, now we've invested in it. Our palaces look like Roman palaces. Our princes are quoting Latin. Now we'll say that we are in a golden age. But then there's immediately discussion of, is this really a golden age? On the one hand, we have all of its trappings. On the other hand, our wars are kind of getting worse, not better. And, this whole idea of peace, which was the goal, doesn't seem to be coming, right? Because it's useful for us to remember that when in 1400 somebody says the Roman Empire, hey, let's bring it back, they aren't thinking about the sexy emperors that we depict in costume dramas where they're having orgies. They're thinking of the Pax Romana. They're thinking of the period under Augustus, and then a little while later under the good gay emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. The only period of extended peace that Italy has ever known in the historical record, right? The moment when the Temple of Janus is closed and the world, as they know it, is at peace. When there are no bandits on the roads or pirates on the seas. And this is a level of peace and stability and order that we still haven't matched. There have always been pirates on the seas at every other point in human history. There are pirates on the seas in the Mediterranean now. We have not matched this. And when you're living in the plot of Romeo and Juliet, the idea of the Pax Romana seems like an incredible golden dream. And when I say, bandits on the roads, this is extremely serious. So Petrarch himself, who's famous for being the first articulator of this, the reason he's famous is that he lived in a commune of scholars and they all died in the Black Death except him.
Wow.
And so he's the one who lives and who is able to articulate this stuff. And his letters from during the Black Death are absolutely heart-wrenching as you see him, the first time a friend dies saying, I know this is God's will. My friend is in a better place now. I've consoled myself. And when it's the third and the fourth and the fifth friend, it's hard to understand this plan, but I'll try to have faith. And when it's the 10th and the 11th, he's just, what is the line? I don't understand what our generation did that was so much worse than every other generation of the world that we deserve this.
Wow.
And you can see that he's just lost his religious ability to cope with this. He can no longer convince himself that it is some beautiful providential plan. He can't. It's too terrible. And after the Black Death moves on and things are easing up, he gets letters that two of his more distant friends have survived. He had lost his whole circle of nearby friends, but two others. And they were going to travel to visit him, and he was super excited. And then they were attacked by bandits on the way. One of them was killed, and the other was brutally wounded and didn't recover for several more years before Petrarch was able to see him again. So when I say the Pax Romana meant there were no bandits on the roads, to Petrarch, this is a golden age. And when he thinks, and this is due to the education of the princes, and they ruled well, we can do this. The dream of that feels fragile like starlight, but world-changing, takes off propagandistically.
It's hugely important to him.
Yeah.
If we expand our worldview a little bit, does the concept of the Renaissance come from other places as well? Is there an Islamic, Middle Eastern, what's happening in Jerusalem or India? Is there similar?
They're rich and technologically advanced and never need this because they didn't lose all the stuff the way Europe did.
Okay.
They still have advanced steel, advanced mathematics, incredible wealth.
Right.
When elements of the Renaissance begin to really get going in the mid-1400s, Mehmet the Conqueror actually has some, Italian humanists at his court doing Italian art and so on. And his son, Bayezid II, ends up just saying, we don't need this. Our culture is way more advanced than this. Go away.
Right.
Or more prudently. So here's the interesting thing. If you're doing this Renaissance thing and you're saying, okay, civilizedness and excellence for a statesman is being like Rome. And we want to have Roman stuff and we want to decorate our palaces in a Roman style and we want to have Roman rhetoricians. The problem with this is Rome will always win this game. And you can be the king of France and you can spend a whole lot of money importing and commissioning Roman art, but Rome can dig a hole and there will be Roman art there. Italy and Rome will win this game. You are playing a cultural competition in which you will lose. And coming in second can be very powerful because you can be the most Roman transalpine power. But fundamentally, Rome wins the Rome game. And nobody will ever be more like Rome than Rome, although they certainly try. Mm-hmm. And so Bayezid looks at that and says, why play a cultural game where I lose when in every other cultural metric I win?
Right.
I'm richer. I am more advanced. Europe is straggling around, scrambling to make these new, beautiful Renaissance libraries, which have 1,000 books, right? Up from the medieval record of the University of Paris, which in the year 1300 had 600 books. That was the largest library in Europe, which is impressive when every book is hand transcribed on vellum, sheepskin and calfskin by monks. So the production of a single book costs as much labor as building a house. And the production of a single book is therefore a $100,000 to $300,000 project. 600 is impressive. At the same time, the Ottoman sultans have a library of 7,000 books.
Right.
Because they're just that rich.
So they're not even close. They're not even comparable. They're orders of magnitude greater.
Right. So they don't have a rebirth because they don't have a period in which they feel like they've lost. They're just always wealthy. The wealth is coming through from the Silk Road. And there's a very telling bit in the prologue to Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. So this is, Vikings, but contemporaries of Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard. So high medieval, where he's describing the geography of the world. And he says, when you go further north, it gets colder and colder and colder until there's ice forever. And if you go south, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter until there's fire forever.
Right.
This is very plausible when you're a Viking.
Yeah, it makes sense, yeah.
And if you go west, there's water forever and ever and ever. And if you go east, people get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier until the world is made of gold.
Oh, wow.
That's the opinion that Northern Europe has of the Middle East and China beyond it in this period, is that objects of impossible expense, silk embroidery, beautifully colored fabrics, gemstones, come from there. And
spices, literally. Yeah, spices.
And our gold goes there. And they're not wrong about this. We've done metallurgical analysis. All the gold that the Spaniards got from the New World, all of it ended up in China.
Right.
We can do metallurgical analysis of gold and figure out isotopically where it came from. And all of it ends up in China. Like, there's just this gold siphon that is the Silk Road. Gold goes east, spices and silks and other goods go west.
I wonder if that motivated the Vikings to go down, the rivers and explore and look for whether there was this idea that the further east you go, the more wealth there is. Therefore, you should adventure east because that's where the money is.
I mean, this is how we end up with Vikings working in the employ of the Emperor of Constantinople, being like, what's better than being king of Sweden? Being in the guard working for the Emperor of Constantinople, because we live better than kings do back at home.
I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right, aren't you? The access to food and spices and the weather, apart from anything else, if you like that kind of a weather, and everything, cleanliness, health.
All the crops you can grow when the winter isn't 90% of your life.
Yeah.
Being able to grow wheat and eat dates. And
we could keep chatting for ages about this. Is there anything I've missed out in particular that you want to call people's attention to in your book?
One of the things the book looks at a lot is how there are stages to this project of making a golden age, where it begins with, hey, is the solution to our problems making a golden age using this classical material? Focused on education. But then the execution of it comes in the art. And we look around and we see that art because that art is in museums. Or we visit Italy and we see Florence and we see Venice and we go, wow, right? And we see that and we say, wow, that's definitely a golden age because this object that is in front of me is so beautiful. But there's a radical difference between how golden the objects are that survive versus what it actually felt to live on the ground, right? Is a golden age the produce of the age, or is the golden age the feeling of living in it? And there's a letter, which is my favorite Renaissance letter, although there are competitors, I would say a good runner-up is the letter, "Dear Mom, I left my favorite purple bathrobe at home. Please bring it when you come. Sincerely, Lorenzo de' Medici." I really like that letter. Also, all the letters where Machiavelli's wife and mother are bugging him to eat his vegetables. While he's like, "Mom, I'm at the court of the King of France." And she's like, "I'm sending you pickled vegetables. You're not eating vegetables enough." Because these are real people and they have the same problems we have. But there's a letter Machiavelli received in 1506. He had been writing a history of the decade they just lived through. So a 10-year history. And his friend Ercole Bentivoglio, a mercenary captain, had read the first half of it that was circulating and wrote and said, "Machiavelli, you must finish your history of this decade, because without a good history of it, future generations will never believe how bad it was. And they will never forgive us for having lost so much here in Italy so quickly." That is the decade in which Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa, Michelangelo carved the David, Raphael is working on a lot of his most beautiful religious frescoes, Josquin des Prez is composing the music. It's the decade that we would point to as the peak of this golden age, and living through it felt like an apocalypse that the later world would never believe in. And it causes us a kind of a mental whiplash to say, wait a minute, the David and the Mona Lisa, these things are not the fruits of an era of comfort and contentment and happy fruitfulness. They're the output of a moment of desperation. And they are the output of a moment of desperation. They are the desperate measures taken at a desperate time. I find that very important for us to return to when we look around ourselves and feel how desperate it is. And we look at the past and say, wow, they were really on top of stuff in the past. Like right now, things suck. I know because I feel like things suck every day when I wake up. And it's useful to just be reminded that things sucked every day when Machiavelli woke up. And things sucked every day when Shakespeare woke up. And, you know, Shakespeare has multiple rants about fake news and the problems with the press and how all sorts of foolish people are believing nonsense because they see it in print and it's leading them to political imprudence and causing terrible tumults. And we face major political threats and major existential threats right now, and it feels like the worst the world has ever been. But it's the worst our lived experience has been. It's not worse than past generations faced. And I think we can take a comfort from that solidarity over time, that many generations have faced moments of, oh no, future generations will never believe how much we lost how quickly in this decade. That feeling, that existential feeling of crisis is not unique to our generation. It's pretty common among many generations. One of the big causers of it is the acceleration of change in the world when people try to change the world deliberately. The Renaissance tries to change the world deliberately and succeeds, and things get weird, and weird often becomes chaos, and chaos is scary. And the advent of the printing press, which you mentioned, which isn't before the Renaissance, it's actually a symptom of this. In wake of Petrarch, everyone wants to make libraries. Everyone wants to make libraries. Demand for books goes up. Demand for books goes up. A clever inventor decides to meet that demand. So the printing press is not the causer of the library building movement. It's built to meet the library building movement, to make this cheaper and faster, and succeeds. And suddenly, instead of a book costing as much as a house, a book costs a school teacher's salary for 1 month, which is still a lot compared to what it costs for us, but it is much, much less. And suddenly, any wealthy person in any wealthy town can contain a library instead of only the very wealthiest and only major cities. Whenever information moves faster, cultural change accelerates, people get new ideas, people organize in new political ways, you then have political tumults. And every information revolution has caused consequent political revolutions. We're living in that right now with social media. Yeah. Shakespeare lived with that with the pamphlet revolution. Machiavelli lived with that with the printing press revolution. Everybody has lived with that for 550 years.
Change is painful, but it can also generate great creativity in the arts. I think sometimes some of the best music, some of the best writing comes from, as unpleasant as that might be, comes from stressful circumstances. And it's a way of people expressing themselves and manifesting that. If everything's easy, you haven't got much to write about, potentially, really. You have no reason to.
So I have looked a lot into that attitude, which is a 19th century one.
Okay, so it's not true.
Well, no, we get different art when the artist is stressed and in pain. We absolutely get different art. And that different art is fascinating. It's about serious stuff. But we would have a lot more Michelangelos if Michelangelo hadn't lived through this nonsense. And you see that when you read his autobiography and he talks about the papacy of Pope Adrian IV. Pope Adrian the No Fun, who was elected at one point. And during this, Michelangelo was caught up in military situations and also a lawsuit and also a lot of other things. And he writes, I couldn't touch a chisel for 2 years. I was too stressed out. I just couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. In the same way that many of us during the worst parts of COVID felt that we just couldn't do what we normally did. We were too stressed out. We did other things. We rage baked. We did what we could, but we couldn't do our normal produce, right?
Yeah.
If Michelangelo had lived in peaceful times, we would have way more Michelangelos. They would be about different subjects, right? We wouldn't have the David, because the David is about Florence's desperation to try to face off against the Goliath that is France, and the Goliath that is the papal armies threatening siege. And so Florence represents itself as the youth, the small boy who nonetheless is strong and stands up against giants. In a peaceful era, he probably would have done a different statue representing Florence in a different way. So we don't get more or better produce out of artists in desperate times. We get different produce. And every artist you ask would say, yeah, I would produce twice as much if I wasn't incredibly stressed out by a persecuting pope, and would choose that life in a heartbeat. But we do get dramatic innovation. And that innovation shapes us and is the color that we have, right? And we are the world that got the David, not the world that got the peaceful statues, of which there would have been 4 or 5 made in the same time period, that we don't have because we did have the war. And so we have one piece and it's about the war instead of 4 pieces about the peace. And we accept and deal with that, and we become the society that grew out of the fruits of our own past grim moments.
I think that's a wonderful place to finish it. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat, Ada. I really appreciate it. I've learnt quite a lot. And more interestingly, I've got things to think about now about what this period in history actually is. Mm-hmm. And next time I talk to somebody about the medieval, I'm going to be even more fuzzy about what I'm talking about. That's the trouble. The more you look into it, the more the picture disappears and dissolves into something else.
Yeah. I mean, I like to describe medieval and Renaissance like a wedge that's just, it's widening and it's widening and widening, and more things are happening. And at some arbitrary point in that wedge, somebody draws a line that said, it's Renaissance now. And they're like, that line could have been earlier or later. This is one contiguous set of changes.
Yeah.
Why are we drawing the line now? Oh, I see. It's because you want to say Shakespeare or just get a play or Petrarch or whatever is the centerpiece of the
modern day cultural overlays. As always, you have to be so careful judging the past with the knowledge that you have yourself.
And the core of that, right? The definition of Renaissance isn't about the Renaissance. It's about what we think is modern. And your claim, what is the beginning of modern? It's capitalism, or it's nationalism, or it's this thing. And it has nothing to do with actual realities of the period. It has everything to do with making claims about our present.
Wonderful. So, Ada, just to finish with, the name of your book and where it's available, please.
Inventing the Renaissance, Myths of a Golden Age. And it's available anywhere that you would normally look for books.
In all good bookshops and some online.
Yep. Support independent bookshops.
I 100% agree. I was going to say exactly that. It's very important. Go and buy books physically. I do read ebooks as well, but I also buy the real thing. And I think it's really important to do both. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's been a treat.